Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Critical Conversations, where we discuss social, political and religious trends related to the Muslim world. Our focus today is the dire humanitarian crisis in Syria, which has reached staggering proportions. Syria's pre-war population was approximately 23 million. Since the conflict began 4 years ago, more than 220,000 people have been killed. According to UN estimates, approximately 8 million Syrians are internally displaced and more than 4 million have become refugees in neighboring countries. In other words, more than half of Syria's pre-war population is currently displaced. To discuss the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis, we are joined today by Dr. David Mednicoff, Director of Middle East Studies at the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at the University of Massachusetts. He is also Professor of Public Policy at UMass Amherst. He recently returned from the region where he visited the Zaatari Refugee Camp in Jordan, home to approximately 80,000 Syrian refugees. Dr. Mednicoff, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So you were just at the Zaatari Camp in Jordan, which was set up in July 2012 and was the first point of arrival for a lot of the fleeing refugees. What did you find there when you visited, and what were the general conditions in the camp?
So of course, when one goes to a refugee camp, the expectation is that you'll see a lot of people in dire straits. The Syrian situation is particularly acute in that so many older people were killed, that there's just a tremendous amount of children. So you kind of expect to go in and see tough conditions, a lot of kids without a lot of opportunity, and of course that was true. But I also was not just impressed, but really in a lot of ways inspired and encouraged by two other things that the visit really pointed out. I mean, one is that the UNHCR and other officials that run the camp, in collaboration with the Jordanian military and Jordanian officials, have done a quite good job of keeping order in the place. I mean, when the place first opened up, there was a lot of crime. People were not. It was not easy to account for people. But I think that the Jordanian authorities have really worked with people in the camps and with international officials to make Zaatari, for a place of so many displaced human beings, quite orderly. And that was, that's what they said when we met with all the officials. But then as we looked around, it was clear that basic safety, a lot of services, were in place. So that was one very encouraging piece of news from the visit. And then the second thing that I saw is that there really are a lot of innovative programs going on that aspire to give at least some of the refugees not just something to do with their time, but skills. There were students who were taking classes at local high schools, mostly remotely, but they were going to finish their high school degrees, and we talked to several who were trying to do their exams to get into Jordanian university. And as hard as that would be for them coming from Syria and living in a camp where there's not a lot of electricity during the day, there are so many other bleak conditions. My colleagues and I were very impressed with their stamina, general youthful idealism and determination to do something. There are these other vocational programs that are run by UNICEF and other children-oriented refugee programs that specifically try to give vocational skills that will then be useful in the camp. So they were training people to cut hair. They were training people to repair electronics. As you can imagine, sustaining these kind of programs is very hard, both financially and because there's always a tension with refugees. Jordan has been very generous in hosting these people, but the Jordanians don't exactly feel capable of assimilating hundreds of thousands of additional population when they have their own economic woes. So that sense that we want the refugees, from the Jordanians' part, to have skills, to be able to do things. We don't want them to actually be able to take jobs from Jordanians who need jobs themselves, is very palpable. But despite that, I think we ended up, my colleagues and I, feeling there's a lot of stuff that can happen that, that's useful. I mean, if some of the when the basic infrastructural problems are resolved, as some of them were in Zaatari, there, is a possibility that people can, if not have full and rich lives in such an environment, at least have basic order and a sense of daily stability.
Sure. And you sort of talked about the tension between the sort of the refugee community sort of based there and also the host communities, the Jordanians themselves. Jordan is supposed to be the third driest country in the world. And you talked about competition in terms of employment and, will these refugees take away some of those Jordanian jobs? But also in terms of resources, water resources, how is that being handled, with an influx of such a large refugee population?
It's very difficult, and I do want to sort of start, since I'm talking to a local American audience, with just the amazing. I mean, it really is amazing that Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan are taking hundreds of thousands of people from Syria. I mean, millions when you add it up, into their countries. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of basic generosity, given that all of these countries have their own problems and population issues that we just have to acknowledge right off the bat. I mean, with refugees, it's often, I think, assumed that most refugees come to the West, but it's much, by a staggering proportion, it's in fact the case that refugees tend to go to neighboring poor countries. And so this is something to start off with and really to emphasize. But as to your question, it's very rough. Jordan has, like Arab countries generally, a long-standing set of problems around actually, ironically, reaping a success story. I mean, one of the things that Arab governments have done very well in the last 40, 50 years is radically improve health prospects for young people. And what's happened is that, throughout the Arab world, there are these youth bulges where the population on average is in the 20s. And there's just so many young people, flooding the market looking for jobs in economic conditions globally that are not producing anywhere near enough jobs, even if you didn't have, millions of people in their 20s. So this youth bulge is a problem throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and it's a problem that, created by good government policies. I mean, oddly enough, when we think of Arab governments, and at the end of the day, there's really not much that the Jordanians can do to finance or support the infrastructure that the refugees need. They're very dependent on international aid for that. But when the money is there, as it at least had been, perhaps until sort of this year when people are getting compassion fatigue, when the money is there, the Jordanians provide a lot of logistical, military, infrastructural support to make sure that the supplies that the international community are paying for can get to the camps.
Excellent. Well, that's wonderful to hear. And so you were there as part of the iPlatform delegation. And iPlatform, I believe, is a UK-based organization where they bring together policymakers and young people to come up with innovative ways to address global challenges. After your visit, perhaps you and iPlatform have now sort of taken on the Zaatari Camp and are trying to sort of improve conditions over there. Can you tell us a little bit about your project, what you're envisaging, and how it will address the situation?
Sure, and let me just say, so iPlatform is a small, new, as you say, UK-based NGO, and I'm very privileged to be the kind of in my lack of spare time, the academic director. So my goal is to really try to think about intellectual academic initiatives. But I work with Dr. Malik Dahlan, who is a prominent Saudi attorney, who has a real vision that what we really need in solving contemporary policy problems are easy ways for young, idealistic kind of would-be policymakers to get together with really experienced and senior people, I mean, academics like myself, but also government leaders. And he's very well linked to be able to make those kinds of connections. So we were there in Jordan because he was giving the keynote address as an alum for the Golden Jubilee of Jordan, of the University of Jordan. And as part of that, we were looking at a variety of initiatives that maybe we could try to partner with the government, the royal family, and some of our stakeholders outside of the Middle East. So the camp was one effort to see are there ways that we can do something. I mean, obviously nobody's going to solve this problem by themselves, but can we make a difference that's particularly around youthful engagement in global problem solving and youthful empowerment. So what we're trying to do is one or possibly two things. I mean, one very prosaic but very important thing we're seeking to do is to set up scholarships for some outstanding young people in the camps where they could study at Jordanian University, and also link up to kind of policy training, advanced training remotely with sort of people like myself, I mean, global experts, but really find a way to take at least a small group of that population and give them, an outstanding educational opportunity so that they can really make a difference, in their own community problems and, just more generally make a difference. We're also trying to think about, I mean, we're interested in setting up something called an innovation lab, which is basically a policy-oriented or a problem-solving, a political problem-solving entity along the lines of some of the economic entrepreneurship labs that you see at a lot of universities. So what we're really interested in is finding ways of incubating really interesting ideas to look at the kinds of problems I just described, like the Arab youth bulge, with fresh eyes through kind of a sustained sort of innovation lab. And it's possible that we'll be actually able to set something like that up in the camp. I mean, we're thinking about trying to do that. But for us, the bottom line is, with the refugees in general and with Arab youth in particular, we're looking at the potential for really a lost generation of people who are either repressed by their governments or, in this case, stuck in these really hard camps with no sense of where their future is going to be. And we really believe that the key to a lot of things, and of course I do personally as a professor, is getting youth, in that sort of 15 to 25-year-old range, and inspiring them, and really not just telling them that they can be part of the solution, but giving them the means and the contacts to really be able to, themselves feel like they're part of the solution.
Sure, absolutely. And so you said that the innovation lab would be set up within the camp itself. How long, do you think some of the refugees that you met over there, how long do you think they're going to be there? Is there this, for them to be able to participate in a meaningful and effective way?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, the problem with the camps, and whether we, right now, this whole idea of whether we do where we would do an innovation lab is very open exactly for this problem, because as you suggested, as I hinted before, the government of Jordan is very keen on trying to give these refugees a chance, but is not obviously talking about any sort of permanent resettlement of hundreds of thousands, because it's also important for people to know that it isn't just the populations in the camps. I mean, so Zaatari has, when I was there, 83,000 people, and then there's another camp that was set up to be much bigger that only has, I think, 20 or 30,000 people, because the conditions are not very orderly and good. So a lot of Syrian refugees choose to live without the benefits of legal refugee status, but just kind of on their own in other parts of Jordan. So it's estimated that there are somewhat over 1 million refugees actually in Jordan from Syria, many of them just living on their own or squatting where they can find a place. So in this kind of an environment, clearly the Jordanian government, does not feel that sort of an additional 30% population is something that they can sustain. And that exactly is this problem of, how transient they are. Unfortunately, at the moment, these refugees aren't going anywhere. I mean, we can talk about, where they might go, but they don't really have anywhere else to go. So there is a certain amount of stability in the population. People who, there are people that have been there 2, 3, 4 years, and I think if you can find, for those people, for example, who've been able to set up a business, there's a well-known business street in the middle of the camp that residents ironically refer to as the Champs-Élysées, with a bunch of stores. But the people that actually run those things, have stable livelihoods, contribute to the camps, and are there long term. So there is at least enough of an infrastructure there that, I think that we have hope that we can do something.
And given the population, it's about 83,000, as you said, it's almost set up like a city, and perhaps is comparable to, the population-wise, to a lot of Jordanian cities.
It's true. It's the 4th largest city in Jordan now.
Wow.
And it is something again that's amazing, and you sort of it does make the idea of actually being at a place like this in person rather than, even if you're sort of an expert like myself, assimilating the facts about it, it makes the visit really worthwhile. What you see is the real, you see human ingenuity in that, even in a condition, even in these circumstances where people have lost their homes, they don't know where they're going, they're in the middle of a desert, the electricity's off a lot of the time. You see people carve out a functioning society. I don't want to glamorize it because, what we really need to do is find a way to, to really regularize these people's situations and take them out of limbo. But you really do see in a refugee camp like Zaatari both an immense amount of human compassion and caring and quite a lot of entrepreneurship around people just saying, okay, this is what we're stuck doing.
Sure.
We're going to try to at least make this a daily, tolerable, regular life for now.
And do you see, how cohesive is the community there? Do you see some of the sectarian tensions sort of spill into the camp, or is it more of a, everybody's there in the same kind of situation and trying to make ends meet, and is there more unity perhaps?
I think that it's also important, sort of both intellectually and ethically, for somebody like myself who is really just there for a short period, not to over generalize from the experience. Certainly the refugee officials who live there and the camp members could say much more than I could about something like this. But what I will say is that when you have people in this sort of an environment where they really have to take stock and think about what kind of a future they can have, they see that they're in direct contact with people from other countries who are coming from a different vantage point as administrators, but are clearly there because they care. So what you really see are opportunities for interactions that wouldn't necessarily be true for most of us in our daily lives. And it's in those opportunities, it's in Syrians from a variety of, as you suggest, sectarian perspectives who have to basically live together. It's in Syrians who may never have, from a remote village that may never have, where they may never have encountered Danes or Norwegians or Americans. It's in the weirdness of a community like this. It's not a community that, I want to glamorize again, but in the weirdness of, I guess to use a big academic word, the liminality, the sort of transitory nature of this community, that there's really potential for people to see each other in different lights. And what I want to really stress is that These are not people, these refugees who see themselves largely as helpless victims or, looking for simple charity. I mean, they want to be able to use their business acumen. I mean, some of these people are were the most established business people in Syria. They want to use their skills to build something. But they're also at a point that they can appreciate and will appreciate the people that are really sort of taking care of them and are saying, okay, we see that what you've been through is really unfair, and we want to try to not just give you a handout, but to really empower you. So, the opportunity for sort of bridging conflict here, mistrust, misunderstandings, is ironically quite great.
Interesting. So the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, has requested developed countries to take in about 130,000 refugees, Syrian refugees. Germany has offered to take in about 30,000. The US this year will take in about 2,000 and has come under considerable criticism for the small number of refugees that they will take in, given the situation that it is. Can you talk a little bit about the politics of resettlement here in the U.S.?
Sure. I think that we have a variety of political misconceptions, and perhaps an understandable fear around what would seem to be risk-taking, that, taken together, make this a really tough sell to really increase our refugee numbers. I mean, the political misconceptions are, of course, one that I know that you and your work fight all the time, which are sort of basic misconceptions around Islam, or basic misconceptions around the Middle East, where for reasons that I get because of popular discourse, but I mean, as somebody who's lived all over the Arab and Muslim world, know to be false. There's this sense that, okay, well, you don't want to have potential terrorists on your soil, and I mean, that's a hard thing to fight. I mean, it's always a hard thing when people do not actually encounter other individuals to sort of get around, when we just have this society that's just so full of really nasty political discourse from all sides. So I think that fighting that sense that how can we take in Middle Easterners? Middle Easterners are the scariest folks. That's a really important problem, and I mean, it's easy for somebody like myself to just kind of be, I don't know, discredited by folks that in fact themselves have not encountered people. But, when you go to a refugee camp like this, what you see is smart, capable people who are looking for a chance to really contribute to society. And that is the best kind of immigrant that could come to the United States. So, I feel certainly very strongly that this whole initial feeling around, well, these people could be terrorists, is by and large misplaced. I mean, there's lots, good security scans could even work on this kind of thing. And again, as you mentioned earlier, Syria is a highly multi-sectarian society, so it's not easy, even as if many of the people, it's not as if all the people in these camps are Muslims. And of course, obviously, most Muslims would have nothing to do with any of the kinds of concerns that people raise. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the U.S. has just not been very good about refugees generally. I mean, compared to what it could do with its relative low population density in parts of the country and its its size. And I think this is part of a larger misconception that Americans have, that the U.S. is really a very generous country. I mean, the typical thing that we all know, or most of us should know, that when asked, Americans will assume that we give like 5 to 10% of the budget to foreign aid, and it turns out that it's at most, it's actually been declining half of 1% of our budget. There are all these misconceptions that people have because I think Americans do want to feel generous about what we really do. And the truth is that the United States has been pretty tough on political asylum and refugees, tougher than many European countries and tougher than most non-Western countries. And so these two political things, the Islamophobia and the general posture towards refugees and immigrants, I mean, I really believe, as a child of some immigrant blood like myself, like pretty much most people, in the country, it's important to really counter. And the other thing is really, it just seems like a risk.
Right.
And this is why I feel very strongly trying to talk about this more, trying to communicate that these are people that are not waiting for somebody to take care of them. These are people that want to find good economies where they can contribute profusely. And the United States is a society where Lebanese Americans, Syrian Americans, people from that part of the Middle East have made a tremendously important impact on American society. And there's no reason to believe that these refugees would be any different, particularly at this moment when, what they want really is to get out of the camp. And I mean, it doesn't make any sense that they're gonna want to somehow be working for the very people that put them in the camps in the first place.
Sure, absolutely. What can ordinary Americans do to sort of help alleviate the situation for Syrian refugees?
Well, certainly charity is very important. I know that when it was World Refugee Day last month, the UNHCR released a report not only highlighting that this is the worst moment in people displaced from their countries since World War II, but that the Syrian problem sort of made up the largest population that was contributing to this, huge numbers of displaced people. Obviously, people get compassion fatigue. Obviously, people feel like, okay, I give $20 to charity, and what can I, that's good, but what can I do? I can't keep doing that. And I understand the kind of compassion fatigue, and I understand very deeply personally the sense of, what can you do? Millions of people, but the truth is the drops in the bucket fill the bucket, and money is needed very sorely, and that is something that people can do. I noticed that yesterday, Tuesday, that there was a big outcry around the shooting that an American dentist allegedly shot this very famous lion, Cecil the lion. And Americans are outraged and want to do something about this. Well, with these millions of people who have been sort of forced out of their homes by war, I mean, this is a really great place to channel that kind of rage, idealism, in a way that's really important. So that's one thing. I do think that lobbying around changing the climate towards political asylum applicants and refugees is very important. Doing things in local communities. I mean, I have been involved in part, thanks to you, in local community work in this. And whenever you talk to people, they say, what can I do? Or I have an idea, I'd like to do this. So, the answers certainly start with education and concern, and I mean, if you're able to, a little bit of charity, but they don't end there. And I mean, I know that this is exactly the kind of issue that people can get very dedicated to doing something about if we can get past that sense of, who am I and what can I do? And I felt this way myself. I mean, but going to the camps, meeting some people, listening to some ideas about concrete initiatives, this is enough to certainly make me want to keep working on this for a long time. Sure.
Dr. Mednicoff, we're nearing the end of our program, but I would just like to quickly sort of request you to address the political situation in Syria. The head of the IRC recently said that, helping refugees is like applying Band-Aid to somebody with skin cancer unless there's, a political settlement found. Do you see, when you were in the region, as you met with, different people in the Gulf countries, etc., that there is some renewed hope since the signing of the nuclear agreement between Iran and P5+1. Also, Turkey's more sort of robust involvement in the conflict. I mean, do you think there's renewed hope for a settlement?
So I do want to, before I answer the political question, I mean, I want to say that I don't entirely agree with that, the metaphor about the Band-Aid and skin cancer, because in a lot of ways, focusing sustained global political effort on the refugee issue in and of itself, I think actually, holds a lot of promise to make a difference in the region, where trying to sort of stop fighting or figure out how to keep the fighting going in the right direction may not have. So I do want to see these things as separate. I mean, obviously, the quote is correct in the sense that as long as there's fighting, there's going to continue to be refugees. But I genuinely believe, as a political scientist and a lawyer, that if sustained attention and new approaches and the kind of global gritty negotiations that led to the Iran deal could occur around the refugee issue in terms of, for example, could Gulf countries fund some people to then be sent or be underwritten to be sent to Western countries? What kinds of cooperation could we see in that regard? Mm-hmm. I think that there's a whole avenue open towards resolving the refugee problem in a sustained political way that would, that would do something in and of itself, and that would we haven't really tried it, and we should. I do believe that the Iran deal, is reshuffling politics in the region in ways that could be useful. I think that the Gulf countries are sort of reeling in a way, but they're going to be forced to, and I think in the case of the Emirates and perhaps Qatar and Oman, somewhat relieved to deal more with Iran. And that, is going to make something of a difference. Obviously, I think the global consensus that's emerging around how bad ISIS is, maybe there are groups, including even the Assad government itself, that do things that are as bad, but the global consensus around ISIS is obviously leading to more attention towards the Syrian situation. So, I mean, I think we are seeing a new moment of new possibilities. But again, what I want to stress is that when a conflict is going on, it isn't always easy to see, for outsiders to really find, the way to stop it or the way to make it go the way they want it to go. And I think that sense that the only thing to do in Syria is to really, be engaged in the conflict and to think about this militarily, that's not necessarily, in my opinion, right. I mean, I think that, sure, we have to think about the military aspects of this, but thinking of the refugee situation in and of itself, because that's much easier for us to relate to. Looking at people in the camps, I mean, for example, UNHCR has this whole set of videos that you can watch on YouTube, seeing what life is like there, and thinking about, what could I do that would make a difference? Money, sure, and other things. That is much easier for ordinary people to think about, or even ordinary government leaders to think about, than military planning and trying to, get the factions straight in Syria.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mednicoff. You shared so many wonderful insights with us and gave us a lot to think about. We're at the end of our program, unfortunately, but again, thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Mehlaqa Samdani.